My dearest brothers and sisters, the headlines in Friday's Wall Street Journal proclaimed inflation reaches 40-year high of 7.9%. Gasoline jumped 38% in February from a year ago, and food rose 8.6%. Now, average hourly earnings rose 5.1% in February from the previous year, but with 7.9% inflation, real hourly earnings fell 2.8%. The average household is spending an additional $276 a month because of inflation. The pundits blame it on shipping bottlenecks, shortages of supplies like semiconductors, and a tight labor market that has pushed wages higher. True, there are supply chain bottlenecks and difficulties, but the price increases all across the board tell us that there's a monetary cause. The Federal Reserve has created trillions of dollars out of thin air. This has led to an enormous stock market bubble and a housing bubble. They give it, this pumping of money, nice sounding names like quantitative easing. But it's nothing less than one of the most radical monetary experiments in history. Printing money leads inevitably to higher inflation and to higher interest rates, which erode profits. And as I said, inflation hits working people the hardest. It is a severe tax upon the poor. After all, they spend most of their income on food and necessities. So what the government gives in stimmy payments, it takes in higher prices and real wage declines. Then there is the trade gap. It grew 27% to a record last year. The U.S. imports far outpaced exports. Think of it. The trade deficit is at an all-time high of $859 billion. We buy far more than we sell. We've become utterly dependent on imports from the rest of the world. In particular, the trade deficit with China grew 14.5% to $355 billion. So what a combination. The biggest trade deficit ever and soaring inflation. So we hear that the Fed is going to inch up interest rates, and while they do so, you can be sure inflation is actually going to be moving higher. There's no question that inflation is going to be worse this year than it was in 2021. The 1 or 2% interest rate increase isn't going to do it. If they do raise to what it will take, we will have a massive recession, a crash in the stock market, and a crash in the real estate market. Paul Volcker, the Fed chairman, years ago, the Fed chairman back in the early 1980s, went to war against inflation with an interest rate of 20%. Whereas all we're hearing in newspapers are incremental increases of 0.25%. That's not going to do anything. But that sort of increase would cause a catastrophe, because the level of debt is now much greater. We are the largest debtor nation in all of human history. A rise in interest rates would be a catastrophe. The Fed is trapped. Their hands are tied. There's really nothing that they can do. Let's look at the background. Over the last decade, the economy has been exceptionally weak. Growth has been exceedingly slow. The economy is in a deep malaise, a sickness, if you will. From 1950 to 1999, real gross domestic product grew 3.5% a year. That's a healthy growth. But in the last 20 years, from 2000 to 2020, it has averaged a meager 1.8%. In other words, growth has been cut in half. In 2008, the crisis came. First, they lowered interest rates to just about zero, but no one was investing. So then they resorted to quantitative easing, which is just a fancy word for printing money. The Fed uses this money to buy securities or government bonds, thereby pumping new cash directly into circulation. During the pandemic, people stopped working. We gave them additional money to buy the stuff that no one was producing, so we have even more money chasing fewer goods. At first it seemed fine. The Feds chose to forget Economics 101, which teaches that there are lags. We now have the consequences. An inflationary tidal wave that's just getting started. Let's go deeper. It was America that was at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution. It was America that showed the world how to mass produce everything from automobiles to television sets to airplanes. But now we are witnessing deindustrialization. We've outsourced. Tens of thousands of factories have left the United States in the past decade alone. Millions upon millions of manufacturing jobs have been lost. The United States lost a whopping 32% of its manufacturing jobs since the year 2000. That comes to 5.5 million manufacturing jobs. Last year, China produced 50%, half of the world's computers and mobile phones. The US produced only 6%. China produces 70 solar panels compared to each one produced in the US. China sells 4 times the number of electric vehicles. America has made itself uncompetitive. We have shifted our industrial base to Asia. We have gone from a manufacturing economy to one based on finance, insurance, and real estate. These do not generate new wealth. Rather, they transfer money from borrowers to lenders, from buyers to sellers. Manufacturing is the engine of accumulation. It alone creates value. It's not banking, insurance, real estate. They simply, as I said, transfer value from A to B. But who is talking about rebuilding the industrial base? Instead, the response has invariably been to print more money. The Fed has pumped an enormous amount of money into the economy. And of course, this results, sure enough, in a stock market bubble and in a housing bubble, no doubt about it. And only later on, after a lag, as I've said, does it result in higher consumer prices, which we're currently witnessing. Now, in days of old, the Fed could only issue money in proportion to its holding of gold. But in 1971, the link between the dollar and gold was ended. There are no more restraints. The currency is backed by nothing but air. Is it any wonder that in every year since 1971, the U.S. has run a deficit? And since then, there's been one stimulus package after another. Endless money has created a bubble economy. The stock market bubble has made a very small group of people extraordinarily rich. The wealthiest 10% of American households own 89% of all U.S. stocks. The top 1% gained over $6.5 trillion in corporate stock and mutual fund wealth during the pandemic. Indeed, its wealth has increased by $25 trillion since 2009. The top 1/10 of 1% own as much wealth as the bottom 90%. This extraordinary polarization of wealth is without precedent in American history. It seems likely that the dollar will collapse, and sadly enough, food prices will continue to soar. Grocery shelves will be empty, and inflation will give way to hyperinflation. Soaring prices will lead to a chain reaction of bankruptcies, and this will culminate in a crash. So it's time, brothers and sisters, to recall the strength and majesty of your forebears, the greatest generation. Let's begin in 1929, the year of the implosion, the most severe economic crisis the U.S. ever experienced. Unemployment rose as high as 25% in the depression that follows. You endured that misery, hunger, and degradation for over a decade. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. And then in 1940, Germany invaded France, Netherlands, Norway, and most of Europe. While in Asia, Japan invaded the northeast Chinese province of Manchuria in 1931. And then in 1937, they took on all of the rest of China. It seemed that sooner or later the U.S. would be involved. It happened on December 7th. It happened with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Your initial shock and dismay gave way to a majestic, righteous anger. You declared war on Japan. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on you. In your resolve, you became united as never before. In 4 years of war, you produced a staggering 300,000 airplanes, 100,000 tanks and armored cars, and 64,000 landing ships, 6,000 Navy ships, 6 million tons of bombs, and hundreds of thousands of trucks and jeeps. All this coming from a place in 1940 where you were still suffering the effects of the Depression, and 9 million of you were unemployed. On the beaches of Normandy, in the jungles of Guadalcanal, in the Battle of the Bulge, you showed the world your indomitability. You came through the bloodiest and most horrific war in history. You were the greatest generation. You saved humanity from radical evil. And that is why, brothers and sisters, I am confident. I am confident that you will come through. You will brush aside the tidal wave of fear and delirium. You will brush aside the hysteria. You will get back to prevention. Your first step will be to consign ultra-processed food to the dustbin of history. You will proclaim a national fast. That's right. Imagine 1 day of drinking water. You will laugh at the pandemic with green drinks of lettuce, kale, Swiss chard, spinach, parsley, and celery. You will rejoice in vigorous exercise. You will rejoice in vitamin D from sources such as wild salmon, sardines, shiitake mushrooms, and sunbathing. You will rejoice in zinc from lentils, beans, and chickpeas. You will rejoice in selenium from Brazil nuts. You will take frequent saunas. You will turn your backyard into a victory garden. And you will come through. You will stand up and be counted for life. How do I know that you will choose life? Abraham Lincoln prophesied it when he said that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Thank you, brothers and sisters. It has been my privilege to share with you. Your comments and suggestions are always treasured by us. Thank you. Let's go forward.